Yeah, I'm going to have to redo the whole thing. We'll start Abelard's life. A quote I like when thinking about his life is, "The men who abandon themselves to the passions of this miserable life are compared in Scripture to beasts." And decided to study philosophy, and later decided he wanted to teach theology. And he went on to do that at Notre Dame. He wanted to teach theology mainly because he didn't necessarily agree with everything that was in place. And we will go over that in a little bit. Abelard developed a reputation as a great educator. Fulbert offered Abelard, who at the time was 42 years old, room and board with him and his 17-year-old niece, Heloise, in exchange for tutoring her. As soon as Abelard saw Heloise, he sought out to seduce her. Abelard would compare Fulbert to a farmer who would trust a tender lamb to a wolf. The quote-unquote tutoring resulted in a long affair with Heloise. Surprisingly enough, Heloise became pregnant with their son, Astrolabe. They then married, despite their differences of opinion on marriage. But there was a misunderstanding when Heloise was dressed as a nun, and Fulbert, in revenge for that, castrated Abelard. The romance between Heloise and Abelard is considered a great romance by many. We know that Abelard is unafraid of controversy. His life ended due to a debate with Bernard of Clairvaux, where his writings that were arguably against the church were condemned. We'll discuss the ideology behind his controversial writings in a little bit. Abelard died a sad, lonely man after Heloise and him were split up. However, they are both buried together in Paris. So we're going to move on to factors that led to Abelard to psychology. Here's another quote from him. "The beginning of wisdom is found in doubting. By doubting, we come to the question, and by seeking, we may come upon the truth." Abelard studied under William of Champeaux, but later went on to challenge his professor and the traditional methods that were presented in those lectures. Abelard also challenged theology and wanted to change the ways people thought. This is really the foundation of Abelard's impact in society and what brought him to society. Abelard had some interesting beliefs on behavior that we're going to talk about. Another quote to credit to this is, "God considers not the action, but the spirit of the action." Abelard's definition of suffering was that suffering is struggle versus will. And there's basically two schools of suffering. There's passive suffering and active suffering. Passive suffering is where it's out of our control. So an example of passive suffering would be if a loved one were in the hospital passing away. We're suffering because we're losing our loved one. However, we're not in control of anything in that situation. Active suffering is where we have control, but we're choosing against our own desires. So, for instance, I'm hungry right now, and I would like to go to McDonald's and grab some food. However, my diet, because I'm on my diet, I'm not going to go to McDonald's. That's an example of active suffering, as I am controlling the outcome, but I'm going against what I would like to do. And so virtue requires effort, according to Abelard. So virtue is not natural, therefore you can't be born virtuous, is what Abelard believed in. So if virtue is present, suffering has to have occurred. The activities and psychology and impact on psychology that Abelard had um, can be felt today. Here's a quote: "The beginning of wisdom is found in doubting. By doubting, we come to the question, and by seeking, we may come upon the truth." Early on, Abelard translated Aristotle's works, but he is best known for the dialectic method, which basically was a series of questions that would cultivate arguments and counter arguments within the church. The idea was that church dogma was no longer following the Bible, so the dialectic method would always point out what the Bible said and what the true essence of that was. The dialectic method did not set out to contradict the church, which is what a lot of people felt that Abelard was doing, namely Bernard of Clairvaux and the Pope. But it was supposed to overcome inconsistencies among philosophers. However, the church saw it differently, and it angered them, and ultimately this is why his writings were condemned for heresy, despite Abelard being a believer in God. So following up on Abelard and his legacy, a final quote will be precise in the use of words and expect precision from others. After a long life that was surrounded by controversy, Abelard left us with the dialectic method and a big impact on society and psychology as a whole, with the idea of challenging the dogma in the church. Thank you to these sources for the information, and thank you for listening to me. I hope I was able to educate you on the great and underappreciated Peter Abelard. Thanks again.